All right, I have the pleasure of sharing with you the third pillar of mental health, distinguishing a moral injury from PTSD. For some of you, this may be an uncomfortable subject because it deals with shame and guilt, something that some of us have experienced as a result of our work. And we're going to talk about PTSD, we're going to talk about depression and anxiety, being the end result of some of the stuff we get involved in. And a lot of the treatment that we get, as you'll hear, is geared towards this whole thing of fear and needing to feel safe again and reassured. Unfortunately, sometimes there are things we have to do at work that have nothing to do with our fear of doing the job, our ability to do the job, but oftentimes with the decision that we have to make in doing the job. And we carry a burden as a result of that. It never became really apparent to me until I sat down in a room with some of the most highly decorated soldiers and police officers that you'd ever want to meet in one room, 14 of them sitting together in one room, sharing their stories. And what amazed me was no one in the sharing was uncomfortable with having done their duty. They were not uncomfortable with the fact that they did what they had to do. What they struggled with was all the burden of their core beliefs being strained in having to do what they had to do. And so we realized that we were dealing with something that had not been dealt with before, and it was the soul, the spirit. So we know, for example, that in the first pillar of healing, that we have things that happen to our body. We know, for example, that when we get traumatized, oftentimes there's some physical things that happen. And we have doctors looking at us in terms of our sleep disorders and our addictions and sexual dysfunctions and hypertension. And so what they do, of course, is they give us a bunch of medicine. And one of the things that I like to point out in this slide is that if anybody ever doubts that there's a physical side to trauma and PTSD, what we have here is, in this slide right here, we have a healthy brain. In this one here, we have a traumatized brain. In this one, we have a PTSD brain. And this was done by Dr. Alexander Neumeister out of New York, and I remember he presented this slide at a depression conference here in Ottawa that I attended. And I must admit it was one of the most depressing conferences I ever went to in terms of the discussions. But I was just taken by this slide because he said, as a scientist, what he was trying to do is develop the chemicals that could address the PTSD side of things. And so what they do, of course, is they look for a cocktail or a choice of agents that they can give us. And of course, we all have different chemicals in our brains. And when we have that chemical imbalance, they try to give us medication. Sometimes it takes 2 to 6 weeks before we react to it. And sometimes we find we're not reacting to it very well at all, so then they do it again. And then they give you medication to counteract what they give you in the first place, and then they give you a new medication. So it becomes very discouraging when we're in this phase. But it's the first line that many of us run into, is the whole medical side of it. The second pillar in the healing process is the mind, when we talk about flashbacks and depression, fears and phobias, nightmares, seclusion, anger, depression, all of those things. And so what we do is we have doctors of therapy, social work, trauma, working together with us to establish self-care plans, to give us awareness and balance and connectivity in terms of what we need to move forward. And some of those therapies are like these, which are very familiar to many of us. Cognitive processing therapy, eye movement desensitization, reprocessing. So many of us are familiar with these things, and that's dealing with the mind and helping us feel safe and secure and get some control back of how we think of things. But the third pillar in the healing process is the moral injury, where we have a loss of purpose and pleasure in life, identity crisis, and self-value, and spiritual confusion. And I can tell you, for me, it means a lot to be able to identify that finally. You know, I have to go back 29 years to the shooting that I was involved in that really sent me in a spiral. And I have to share with you that it was deemed to be a good shoot. As a result of an armed robbery and my reaction to it. And when you walk around with people patting you on the back and telling you that you did a good job, wish more people would do what you did, you couldn't have done anything else. If you tried to do something else, you know, somebody else could have died. You did what you had to do. You took a life to save others. The problem is that what they didn't understand is how I felt about the fact of making a decision that I absolutely believed to be the correct one, and finding out as I went to the suspect and turned his body around and he looked at me as he died, and I pulled his hand out of his pants to realize he didn't have a gun after all. So the decision to react the way I did was the right one, based on all the things that was evident. But morally, I had shot and killed an unarmed man, and he died in my arms. So it was not something I could share with anybody, because everybody was patting you on the back about the good job you did, and how they wish they would have had the courage to do what you did when we get to that moment. And so you suffer silently. And what happens, of course, is you can never admit that in spite of the fact that everybody feels good about you, you feel like a piece of crap about yourself. And so what happens at work is you keep a smile on your face, and you keep the uniform as a barrier as to what you really feel like. One of the doctors from Homewood mentioned earlier that how we behave at work is usually the last place where we show that we're hurting, because the uniform gives us some immunity. There's rules and regulations and policies and procedures that we can work with. And as long as we stay within that frame of mind, we don't have to deal with the soul, because it's got nothing to do with us. It's all about rules and regulations. And suddenly you take the uniform home and off before going home, and suddenly you're yourself. So what was happening at work is everything was fine. But I'd go home and everything was not fine. I was afraid to fall asleep because I would have nightmares about that moment in time when I questioned myself about, did I react too fast? Did I react too quickly? Did I miss something? Did I miss something? Did I miss something? Did I miss something? That broken record that keeps playing in your mind. And you're sitting there watching TV and all of a sudden you hear, did I miss something? Did I miss something? And people are talking to you and all of a sudden it's just their mouths moving and all you hear in your head is, did I miss something? Did I miss something? Because you always feel like you might have missed something in the decision-making process. So that's the email coming through. So what I started to do is I started to drink, because I was afraid to not make it through the night. And it didn't help, of course, that one of the staff sergeants at the time told me to go home and drink. And I had a lot of respect for the old fella. He was a Korean War vet, and he said, sit, go, have a few drinks, and get over it. Well, I had a few drinks, I didn't get over it, so I had a few more. And a few more, and it didn't work. And what happened was I'd end up waking up at 3 in the morning with those nightmares and that voice in my head. And now I'm walking around the living room, back and forth pacing, trying to figure out where I sit here in all of this, and I'm drunk now. And then I started taking medication. More than you need, hopefully, to sleep through. And that didn't work, because I'd wake up with these big headaches. And of course, you know, I'm still going to work every day. I don't want nobody to know. I don't want anybody to know, I should say, that there's something wrong with me. And then I started mixing the two. And that's when it really got bad. And that's when my wife decided I've got to have a conversation with this man about getting fixed. And she's going to share her story later about what it was like for her to see me change as a result of trauma coming home. So the moral injury is the pain that results from the damage to a person's moral foundation. And the thing is it's not something that we can make as a general rule. Every person has their own moral foundation. You know what John talked about, your beliefs. You know, it's not about saying, well, these are my moral foundations, therefore that's the moral foundations you have. This is really about listening to other people, because they have to share with you what their pain is. And it may not be something that you can connect with because of the moral foundations being so personal. But just the fact that you're listening, and sometimes as you're listening to the story, it's close enough to what you've been through so that you can say something that means the world to people like me when I'm revealing stuff like this. Me too. Me too. And it just means so much then that you understand. A painful transgression or an erosion of a sense of goodness and humanity. I didn't join the police service to kill people. Paramedics don't join being paramedics to be standing on the highway and having to decide which body goes in the ambulance that you have because you don't have enough ambulances for all the bodies that are at the accident scene. So you got to start triage. Firefighters looking at a face in the window and not being able to get up the ladder because the building's going to collapse any time now. And making the decision to hold back for the safety of their members, knowing that they're going to lose someone in there. Decisions are made by us as professionals all the time. And we're not afraid of the decisions. It didn't bother me that I had to shoot somebody. I was trained to do that. I always knew that that would be one of the things that I might have to do. But I always thought the decision would be a clean decision. And for me, it never was clean. It's a new term that we're using now, but it's certainly not a new concept. It's been around since the suicide of Ajax in the Trojan War. The whole thing of, I'm not seen as the leader I need to be, and I'm killing people because I'm a leader, as opposed to the truth of it, and so he committed suicide. There's more suicide attributed to the moral injury than there is to the fear and anxiety of PTSD. And I say that because of the 14 soldiers and police officers I sat in that room, was 100% of us had contemplated suicide because of the conflict between our professionalism and our moral being. So where does it fit? Well, you know, we know that a broken bone may not kill a person, but complications do, such as infections and hemorrhaging. Moral injury is the infection, the hemorrhaging to PTSD. It's very subjective, very personal, and it pivots with the dimensions of time. We all know that our moral compass changes as we grow older, right? And it certainly changes as we work our way within the structures. I used to teach ethics to police officers, and I used to have them draw a line on the whiteboard from 0 to 10. And I asked them to measure themselves from 0 to 10 on how ethical they were, 10 being the most ethical, and 0 being the least. And they always put themselves between 8 and 10. I think they were trying to be humble with the 8s. And then I would ask them how they saw their leaders to be ethical. And they would go back to the same line and they'd have everything from 0 to -5. And I would say to them, or I would ask them, so what makes the difference? Why suddenly, if you are all future leaders, and you believe in yourselves to be 8 and 10s, how is it that when you become a leader, you're seen as being 0s to -5s? And we'd have that discussion. And then it came the following. When it's your own personal ethics, it's very easy to manage. The only decision you have to make is the one that you have to react to. When you become a leader, you have to start making decisions that affect other people. And sometimes you have to let some people get hurt for the greater good. It's just the way it is in managing people. So it changes with time and our position in life. It can be linked to cognitive development. What kind of a family upbringing did you have? Did you come from a broken home? Did you come from a home that had addictions in it? Did you come from a very religious home, or a home that just laissez-faire, whatever you want? So the research is being done now that we never had done before, but it's younger than what's being done on PTSD. Moral injury debilitates people. It prevents us from having a full life. When you have a moral injury, when you have a conflict between your PTS and your trauma and your ethical background and your moral standing, you don't live a full life because it's a phony life, because you're forever hiding something. It's a damage to the soul. It holds feelings of extreme shame, guilt, betrayal, regret, anxiety, anger, self-loathing, self-harm, including attempts to take their own lives. Very much so. How many times do we read about people being heroes in the battlefield and committing suicide at home? There are no clear lines separating PTSD from moral injury. However, PTSD treatments focus on eliminating the fear that remains from a particular experience. I'm afraid that this will happen again. I don't feel safe working here if that's going to happen again. I don't feel like I've got control of my environment if those kinds of things happen again. Right? But fear is not always the root cause of the moral injury. I had no fear of the issue of having to use my gun. I had no fear of running into a holdup. That's what I was wanting to do ever since wherever. But the ethical conflicts were strong and difficult to deal with. PTS is about the trauma survived, moral injury is about the damage left by the decision made. It creates a false sense, a flawed sense of who you were when you were in harm's way. So here's what's interesting here, and this is where a lot of the soldiers will relate to this because of the extremes that they get involved in, and many of you will relate to this as well. The conflict and the confusion that arises between the second self with the present self. Most people compartmentalize. There you go. You can tell I have some French. It's very hard to pronounce these English words. They're good memories from the past, but some can't. All right? So we have soldiers that come back and they do battle. We have police officers that get involved in shootings. Don't have a problem with it. Everything went according to Hoyle. Right? Some of us, not so much so. I've met soldiers that told me what really hurt them was actually coming face to face with the enemy as they shot them. Actually seeing that the enemy they were shooting were 14-year-olds and 13-year-olds. Actually seeing that the red mist was actually bodies left on the ground after the bombs hit. And so they're ready to do the battle, but then they come home, and when they come home, they're not able to disconnect from what they did in their duty with what they want to be back home, which is a father, a mother, a spouse, a neighbor, a person who sits in the church.